Hey everybody, this is a review, it's an extended review by Chris Arthur of Enrique Dussel's Towards an Unknown Marx, a commentary on the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. I read the Towards an Unknown Marx like maybe a couple years ago, but I've never read actually the manuscripts or the 3 volumes that constitute the theories of surplus value, which I believe are derived from the 1861 to 63 manuscripts. But I'm sure all this background information is something that Arthur will touch on. Anyway. For many people, this book will be their first introduction to the leading Latin American Marx scholar Enrique Dussel. Although some of his works on the philosophy of liberation have been translated into English, this has not yet been the case with his monumental trilogy devoted to the painstaking study of all Marx's economic manuscripts. So the present translation of the second of these on the 1861-3 manuscript of Marx's Critique is to be warmly welcomed, the editor and the publisher to be congratulated on their initiative in bringing it before us. Given this context, the work serves a double function. On the one hand, it provides us with a way into the highly original interpretation of Marx long advocated by Dussel, while on the other, it is the first work in English devoted solely to the 1861 to 63 manuscript, effectively the, quote, second draft of Capital, if the Grundrisse is counted as the first. Footnote. Dussel holds that there are 4 drafts in all, end footnote. No doubt this second point is the reason for the selection of this middle volume of Dussel's trilogy for translation first. Marx's 1861-3 manuscript was published in German from 1976 to 1982 and in English from 1988 to 1994. Footnote. Oh, never mind, no footnote. Only now, then, can its importance be understood, and Dussel is an excellent guide to its intricacies. In his view, just as in the Grundrisse, we enter into Marx's, quote, laboratory and see how he constructs his concepts and develops his theories. However, given the just mentioned double function of this book series, I intend in this review to concentrate more on the overall interpretation of Marx evident here than on providing a detailed account of the 1861-3 manuscript itself. The 1861-3 manuscript is exceptionally interesting since the 1861-3 manuscript covers the period in which the structure of Marx's Capital was originally laid down. Footnote. It was while writing this manuscript that Marx first settled on the idea of promoting, quote, Capital to its title and reducing, quote, Critique of Political Economy to a subtitle. See Marx de Kugelmann, 28th of December, 1862 in Marx and Engels, 1985. End footnote. The 1861-3 manuscripts includes, in addition to the well-known theories of surplus value extracted from it, a draft of Book 1, Parts 2 to 4, and a first draft of much of Book 3. Dussel's exposition follows Marx's manuscript chronologically, section by section, key to the English translation. It facilitates our understanding of how Marx clarified his thinking on a number of issues, as well as explaining his confusions and difficulties. The manuscript starts with, quote, Chapter 3, Capital in General, end quote, because it is a sequel to the 1859 contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. In this sense, the 1859 contribution must be regarded as part of the second draft of Capital. Footnote, as Marx says, end footnote. Here I must dissent from the claim that Marx's last 3 drafts of Volume 1 start with what became Part 2 because, quote, this part is the real conceptual starting point of Marx's theory, end quote. They start with Part 2 for the much more mundane reason that Part 1 was already published. It was finally redone for Capital's 1867 publication, quote, not only for the sake of completeness, end quote, but also because there must have been, quote, something lacking in the first presentation, end quote, since no one understood it properly. In his treatment of the capital relation, Dussel emphasizes that, according to Marx's theory, living labor is the, quote, creative source of surplus value. Without living labor, capital cannot valorize itself. That capital is the source of capital's own profit is an illusion brought about by the deceptive shape of the, quote, appearances of things. One of the most important strategic moves Dussel makes is the placing of this, quote, source in, quote, exteriority. It comes from outside the value totality systematized by capital. On this basis, Dussel criticizes those such as Lukács, promoting, quote, totality as the key concept in Marx. However, Dussel himself retains the category totality because Dussel is sensitive to the fact that capital does have a totalizing drive, and through its subsumption of labor under its forms, capital generates a contradictory unity with capital's otherness. Quote, other. Nonetheless, Dussel is right to point up the radical otherness of the source of surplus value from the capital totality itself. We shall return to this point. Dussel emphasizes that the, quote, macroeconomic character of Marx's theory is already given in the draft of what later became the chapter, quote, contradictions in the general formula of capital, end quote. It is argued here that the surplus value of the capitalist class as a whole cannot be increased through acts of circulation alone, although the profit of individual capitalists may increase at the expense of others. Footnote. Unfortunately, the text has, quote, new value can emerge from circulation, end quote. Page 6, end of section. The quote, cannot was presumably intended. Theories of surplus value. It was while working on relative surplus value that Marx broke off and began in a new notebook an excursion entitled Theories of Surplus Value, which became a huge work on its own. In fact, more than half of the 1861-3 manuscript is concerned with theories of surplus value. Dussel points out that the significance of these studies has been seriously misconstrued because Engels and Kautsky treated them as equivalent to Marx's promised, quote, Book 4 of Capital. Footnote. This view is uncritically repeated by Ben Fawkes in his 1976 Penguin edition of Volume 1. See his note on page 93, as do the editors of the English collected works. See Marx and Engels 1994, note 240, end footnote. We find Engels writing in his preface to Volume 3 that, quote, I intend to start work on the fourth volume, the history of the surplus value theory, as soon as I am at all able to do so, end quote. But Engels simply failed to see that the theories of surplus value could not have been intended for Book 4 of Capital because at the time the manuscript was composed, there was no such project. However, Dussel does not identify the date when this project for a 4-book, not, quote, volume, Capital, definitely came into being. Footnote. The distinction between books and volumes is important when studying Marx's plan. See the scheme in the preface to Capital. This arrangement of books and volumes is different from the original reported to Kugelmann in a letter of October 1866, but in citing this volume on page 164, Dussel, or his translator, gets it horribly twisted, transposing, quote, books and, quote, volumes, end footnote. It was in March 1865 when Marx signed a contract with the bookseller Meissner for his Capital. Indeed, the publisher was hoping that it would be precisely the book on, quote, the history of political economy, end quote, that would secure the success of the project, and he was most put out that it was never produced by Marx. Confirmation that the theories of surplus value has nothing to do with this Book 4 is found in Marx's letter to Engels of that July about his progress. He states that, quote, the fourth book, quote, has yet to be written, end quote. Since Engels found 3 volumes worth of the, quote, theories, this would be an extraordinary thing to say if it were indeed the 4th book, though more so because Marx habitually exaggerated to his correspondents how much of Capital had already been prepared for publication. While Dussel does not use this evidence, he correctly states that the, quote, theories were not intended for Book 4. Why then did Marx turn aside in the middle of drafting Book 1 to embark on this massive study? One possibility Dussel passes over is that Marx was following the model set by his publication of the first part of his great work, The Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, in 1859. This complemented each of its substantive chapters on commodities and on money with surveys of the literature concerned. This may indeed have been the origin of the, quote, theories. See the plan of January 1863, drafted when Marx had virtually completed, quote, the theories of surplus value. But they go far beyond any such plan. As Dussel rightly argues, the, quote, theories are the site of a critical confrontation with the opposing paradigm. As Dussel shows, quote, this critical confrontation of theories, of categories, hence neither a history nor a theory of surplus value as such, was of great importance in Marx's intellectual biography, end quote. Through this critical confrontation, Marx developed categories that were needed to explain concrete phenomena Marx had hardly treated at all in the Grundrisse. One of the most important was the struggle to clarify the relation between the notion of a uniform rate of profit and that of what became, quote, price of production. I stress, quote, what became, end quote, because one of the things Dussel is able to show is the lack of clarity of Marx's terminology through the early passages. Final clarity about this matter was secured only by a confrontation with Ricardo's theory of rent, itself occasioned by the need to study a work of Rodbertus on the subject before returning it to its owner! Exclamation point. From this almost accidental impulse, Marx developed the categories of distribution. As a consequence of this, the plan for Book 3, originally called, quote, Capital and Profit, was dramatically expanded. The first sign of this was in August 1862, when he told Engels, quote, I now intend, to introduce a new chapter on the theory of rent, i.e. as an, quote, illustration of an earlier statement, end quote, Marx. The plan of Book 3, set out in January 1863, is close to that followed in the main manuscripts of it written as part of the third draft of Capital, 1863-5. However, there is one interesting difference on which Dussel does not comment. In the plan of 1863, the formation of a general rate of profit via prices of production is closely followed by, quote, rent, illustration of the difference between value and price of production, end quote. This placing of the topic conforms exactly to the idea that rent is brought into Book 3 merely as such an, quote, illustration, and not, for example, as a substitute for the originally proposed separate book on, quote, landed property. However, by 1865, quote, rent had detached itself from its close proximity to the transformation problem and was dealt with after other forms of distribution, which in turn might suggest a separate work was now redundant. Sorry, I missed a footnote, but the footnote says, but most unfortunately, on page 152, Marx is misquoted, quote, the price of production of the commodity equal to its value, end quote, is given, but in the source, Marx Engels 1991, page 232, it is clear this happens only under special circumstances. Another issue related to other promised books is that on, quote, competition. Book 3 embodies a paradox. Quote, competition plays quite a large part in it. While yet reference is made, even in the 1863-5 manuscript, to a separate work on, quote, competition. In my view, Dussel's solution is correct. He argues that analysis of the way the distribution of surplus value is regulated by competition does not exhaust the topic. More concrete aspects are still to be developed. Footnote. It is similar to mine in my paper, Capital Competition in Many Capitals. End footnote. Therefore, Dussel suggests that there are two levels of competition in Marx's logical structure. The one, general abstract competition as in Book 3, and two, more concrete aspects held over to a successor work. At all events, as a result of his, quote, critical confrontation, With the literature of political economy, Marx was able to organize the structure of Book 3 and to write the 1863-5 draft of it. The most, I believe, I know that most of what Engels put together as Volume 3 of Capital comes from this 1863-5 manuscript. However, I would like to stress that the 1861-3 drafts of what became Book 2, Parts 1, 2, and 3 are of independent interest since they generally work at a level of conceptualization that is more dialectical than the blander treatment in the draft used by Engels. After all this work on theories of surplus value and the topics of Book 3, Marx finally returned to where he had broken off the draft of Book 1. Dussel shows that in these parts Marx incorporated his study of machinery and the way the mechanized factory results in real subsumption of labor under capital. Dussel is generally a perspicacious commentator on the text, but in my view he fails to bring out properly one of the most important innovations in it, even though he quotes a relevant passage from Marx's discussion of Bailey. Why is Bailey important? As Rubin showed long ago, Marx's review of Bailey's attack on Ricardo was the occasion for a major shift in his conceptual scheme, which I think was never fully worked through. In the 1859 contribution, Marx had unthinkingly copied the two-place logic of classical political economy. There is, quote, exchange value, and there is, quote, labor time. But exchange value can be nothing but the expression of the value of one commodity in an exchange relation between them. But exchange value can be nothing but the expression of the value of one commodity in another commodity when an exchange relation between those two commodities obtains. This reflects supposedly a parallel relation between labor times. Bailey's devastating critique of the Ricardians was that they continually substituted for this, correct in Bailey's opinion, relational view of value, an absolute relational view of value, in which a commodity had a definite value of that commodity's own regardless of its relations, even though that commodity's value could be expressed only through such relations. Marx saw the justice of this criticism and explicitly developed for the first time in his 1861-3 manuscript a concept of value distinct from exchange value. Although as late as the first edition of Capital, a couple of notes claim, quote, value is just an abbreviation of, quote, exchange value. Although Bailey insisted that value could only exist as a relation between two commodities at the same time, Marx was able to point out that capital is a value that compares itself with itself at different times. I think Patrick Murray has a paper titled What Marx Learned from Samuel Bailey. And I think that a lot of the value form people who follow a value form analysis in Capital definitely are. This is extremely important for them because it emphasizes value as a relation, not an intrinsic thing. Just as a side note, isn't really relevant here. Well, it's relevant, but I don't know in what way. But Michael Heinrich in his book explained, it seemed count to me as like value is a relation like this. It would be like commodities have value in a way that would be like if two fire trucks were only red when they were brought into relation to each other. Like they don't have this value in distinction from the world of other commodities. So this is important because it emphasizes that value. I think this also seems very important because it emphasizes the historical nature of value, not as a transhistorical fact of life, but as something specific to a commodity-producing economy. That's just a side note from me. No more from me. I talk too much. So Marx ended up with a three-place concept of value, quote, exchange value, quote, value, end quote, labor time, something which Rubin again deserves great credit for discerning. Quote, exchange value expressed, quote, value, and quote, value in turn represented labor. However, much Marxist work has failed to grasp this and has collapsed value into either, quote, exchange value or, quote, labor time. The trouble this creates was already brought out by Bailey when he observed that Ricardo confused the, quote, cause and, quote, measure of value, both being taken to be labor time. Bailey correctly pointed out that if the labor theory of value was intended to explain changes in the magnitude of value by changes in labor time, then to measure value in labor time results in the absurd tautology. Changes in labor time are explained by changes in labor time. As I say, although Marx had seen the need to secure his own theory against Bailey, there are places where Marx falls back into the Ricardian view when he has in mind simple circulation rather than the circuit of capital, but that is another story. I wonder if that's comparable to what Heinrich says about there being ambiguities in Marx's presentation of value, as on the one hand, and if the substance of value is abstract labor, is that type of abstraction just labor in general, in which case abstract labor is a transhistorical fact of life, or is abstract labor a historically specific feature of a capitalist mode of production? I wonder if that's there's different ways of articulating abstract labor, and there's ambiguities in Marx's presentation that I think is I haven't read it obviously because I don't think it's been translated yet, amongst other reasons why I haven't read it, but I think that's what Michael Heinrich's main thesis, the science of value, is all about. The way that is trying to sifting through these ambiguities in Marx, and that there's not a real clear cut text. I don't know what he actually says, but in my mind, in this made up book, that may not be the case. I think it seems like what he's saying basically is something like there are ambiguities in Marx's presentation, and they're contradictory, and this is usually pretty common with revolutionary breakthroughs in sciences, but that in order to make Marx coherent, we need to reject the kind of physical, or what Heinrich I think would call substantialist conception of value, which views value as something inherent in labor products, as opposed to inherent to products that are produced and distributed within a particular socio-historical format, or something like that. But that's not even relevant to what we're reading. But it's just a thought. It seems like perhaps that's what Arthur is referring to in that last sentence. The last part of Dussel's book consists of two chapters that are more reflective in nature. The first deals with Marx's concept of science and the logic of his categories, returning here once again to the, quote, radical starting point of Marx's theory, namely, quote, living labor, and the possibility of developing an ethical critique of capitalism. The second outlines Dussel's application of Marx's categories, notably, quote, unequal exchange, to the concept of, quote, dependency. Marx's, quote, greatest discovery, end quote. I now want to return to the absolutely central theme of Dussel's interpretation of Marx and the curiously Schellingian cast he gives it. This is the theme of, quote, exteriority as ontologically. Dussel says, quote, metaphorically, but I cannot grasp the distinction. Metaphysically. This is the theme of, quote, exteriority as ontologically. Dussel says, quote, metaphysically, but I cannot grasp the distinction, constitutive of the capitalist world, and methodologically a point of theoretical and practical critique. But as Dussel admits, quote, once capital exists, then the, quote, totality functions as the ontological category par excellence, end quote. Both the propositions that capital is a totality, hence in my view requiring application with the Hegelian categories of the, quote, concept, although Dussel does not make this move, and the proposition that living labor is external to it, are well grounded in Marx's texts. Dussel has no difficulty finding suitable quotations from the 1861-3 manuscript. Labor Marx characterizes as, quote, not capital, but, quote, as living source of value, end quote. There's a footnote. It's very odd that Dussel claims Marx's science is peculiar to him, and then apparently in support of this cites two letters in which Marx says he does science in the same way as other German scholars, end footnote. Dussel sums up his reading of the labor theory of value as follows, quote, commodities, money, and even capital are value objectified labor. On the other hand, living labor is not value, but the, quote, creator of value, end quote. Dussel distinguishes sharply between the value totality of capital and what comes from outside, and this is important, is necessarily redetermined categorically once subsumed by capital. Thus he writes, quote, can it be said that the, quote, living labor, the reality and category is the same as, quote, wage labor, or labor already subsumed within the totality of capital? As subsumed, living labor is an internal determination of capital, and thus founded on the totality of capital. But while living labor has not yet been totalized, living labor is reality, the most absolute reality for Marx and the measure of all derealization in the totality of capital. Living labor is exterior, end quote. Dussel. There is then a transition from what is in origin exterior and in a sense remains so, to what is subjected to totalization. An example of this is when Dussel insists that in this manuscript, quote, labor capacity, end quote, refers to the exteriority that becomes, quote, labor power, when subsumed by capital and taken the shape of one of its determinations. According to Dussel, Marx situates living labor as the, quote, creative source of value, capable indeed of creating ex nihilo, in a way the closed totality of capital is not. Dussel writes, quote, the truth of Marx's analysis rests on and departs from the, quote, real reality of the other different from capital. The living labor is as activity, as creator of value or of all human wealth in general, not only capitalist, end quote. But the source must be categorically distinguished from its result. Marx writes, quote, labor as process, in actu, is the substance and measure of value, not value, only as objectified labor is labor value, end quote. Dussel is right to draw attention to this hugely important distinction. Sorry, there's a footnote here. This fits beautifully into my own reading of value theory in my 2001 essay where I say labor is the negatively posited, sublated ground of value, end footnote. Dussel is right to draw attention to this hugely important distinction. Dussel believes it is the function of Marx's theory of value, quote, I personally believe that Marx thought his greatest discovery was the category of surplus value, or the distinction between abstract and concrete labor. But both discoveries depend on the following, which I affirm was the most important of all, and which Marx himself perhaps was not fully aware: the difference between living labor, substance of, quote, of, end quote, value, quote, without, end quote, value, and objectified labor, quote, with, end quote, value, end quote. Dussel. I, quote, personally believe, end quote, that this insight is Dussel's, quote, greatest discovery, end quote, although below I shall dissent from his formulation of its consequences. Marx picks out the implications of this transition from labor into value when he writes in this manuscript, quote, this process of the realization of labor is at the same time the process of labor's derealization. It posits itself objectively, but it posits its objectivity as its own non-being, or as the being of its non-being, the being of capital, end quote. Marx. Dussel argues that, quote, only from the affirmation of the positivity of living labor, end quote, as an affirmation of otherness, quote, is negation of the negation possible, end quote. The negation of labor by capital can be reversed through a second negation only if it is possible conceptually to separate living labor from its historically determinate form as wage labor in the first place. Only this makes space for a necessary critical distance from the totality. The, quote, labor theory of classical political economy had the merit of shifting attention from the, quote, being of value to value's, quote, becoming. However, since they could not achieve this critical distance, their, quote, labor theory remained within the capital totality. Only the critically adopted standpoint of living labor allows space for conceptualizing the overthrow of capital. Schelling and Marx. Some coffee here. So far, I've managed to avoid any reference to Dussel's Schellingian reading of Marx, but it is essential to expand upon Dussel's Schellingian reading of Marx here, not only for its own sake, but because I fear certain of Dussel's turn of phrase will baffle the reader because he does not sufficiently explain the Schellingian provenance of his categories. This pertains first and foremost to the terms, quote, being and, quote, reality, which are clearly opposed here, even though in ordinary language they would be taken as cognate. I also address here the interpretive problem of the alleged influence of Schelling on Feuerbach and Marx. Although Schelling and Hegel had been close at the outset of their careers, Schelling and Hegel had drifted apart so far that 10 years after Hegel's death, Schelling was called to Berlin by the authorities with the mission of extirpating Hegelianism from German intellectual life. I'm not sure if it's Schelling, but I think there's like a famous Schelling speech that had like three famous people, I believe, claimed to attend. I think Soren Kierkegaard, Mikhail Bakunin, and Friedrich Engels were in attendance, but I'm not sure. The main rubric of his lectures of 1841 was the contraposition of his, quote, positive philosophy, end quote, to Hegel's allegedly, quote, negative philosophy. According to Schelling, Hegel's apotheosis of reason with a, quote, big quote, R was necessarily defective. Quote, reason can take apart and reconstruct the world and therewith provide a full explanation of what the world is, but reason cannot explain that the world is. Quote, being, in Hegel's system, is a descriptive category of thought, a category from which an entire system of thoughts derive, up to and including the, quote, absolute idea. But there is always something else behind this totality, the reality that reveals itself to us in a non-rational mystical mode, and its, quote, explanation, insofar as one is possible, is that God reveals to us his power in this he creates ex nihilo. In this his creation ex nihilo. Ex nihilo, I believe, means from nothing. Dussel's claim is that Marx was not only accepted the spirit of this critique of Hegel by the old Schelling, but made parallel moves in his theory of value. Footnote. Dussel's view that Marx was influenced, quote, directly or indirectly, end quote, by Schelling is further developed in a conference paper of 1997 by Dussel. Dussel's claim is that Marx not only accepted the spirit of this critique of Hegel by the old Schelling, but made parallel moves in his theory of value. The totality of value forms is inherently self-referring. The, quote, being of the system is value itself. But beyond this totality, we have seen is the real source of surplus value, living labor. This explains Dussel's peculiar terminology in which, quote, non-being is equated with what is real. Dussel claims that, quote, it is well known, that Marx is an heir to the old Schelling, the one who in 1841 criticized Hegel in Berlin, the one who placed Hegelian philosophy as negative and affirmed a positive philosophy, end quote. Footnote. It is curious that Dussel uses the expression, quote, well known, since it is, quote, well known to him that he goes against Engels and Lukács in this claim. On this page, a couple of quotations, presumably from Schelling, are apparently attributed to Hegel, question mark. I mean, not question mark, exclamation point. It was certainly, end footnote, it was certainly not, quote, well known to Marx, exclamation point. With reference to this same, quote, old Schelling, and these same 1841 lectures, some of them published in 1842, Marx wrote to Ludwig Feuerbach on the 3rd of October, 1843, imploring him to take up the cudgels against Schelling, quote, the entire German police is at his disposal, as I myself once experienced when I was editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, ... You are just the man, bracket, to be the, end bracket, opponent of Schelling, end quote. Marx also went back to his doctoral dissertation to insert a passage reminding the Schelling of 1841 of some of his radical early views. Just because Feuerbach himself accentuated the, quote, positive, this is no reason to conflate the, quote, left and, quote, right critiques of Hegel. For Feuerbach, the positive, which stands in no need of mediation in an opposite, was, quote, sensuous. Not only is Dussel wrong about Marx, Dussel is also wrong about Feuerbach when Dussel says, quote, thanks to the old Schelling, Feuerbach was able to start the anti-Hegelian critique, end quote. Feuerbach had been working his way out of Hegelianism through the 1830s and published his definitive text towards a critique of Hegel's philosophy in 1839. Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity followed in 1841. By the time Schelling gave his Berlin lectures of 1841, Feuerbach had already ensconced himself in rural isolation at Bruckberg, there to compose a flood of philosophical manifestos, no, quote, thanks to Schelling, end quote. Footnote. In his preliminary theses on the reform of philosophy from 1843, Feuerbach wrote, quote, in Schelling, bracket, is found, end bracket, only the illusion and pretense of being the new realistic philosophy, end quote. Martin McIver points out points out to me that Manfred Frank, Warren Breckman, and others claim Feuerbach could have been influenced by expositions of Schelling's, quote, positive philosophy earlier than 1841. I think I have a Warren Breckman piece on Castoriadis on here, if you're curious. If Marx needed any help in disengaging himself from Hegel, it was Feuerbach, not Schelling, who counted in this, as can be seen from the preface to Marx's 1844 manuscripts. Dussel would have been well advised to eschew these dubious historical remarks and simply to argue that the analogy of Schelling's Hegel critique with Marx's critique of political economy is revealing, or to restrict himself to the claim that a Schellingian reading of Marx is a useful corrective to the Hegelian one. In a nutshell, Dussel thinks Hegel an excellent guide to the capital totality, but not to the capital totality's critique. The occluded exterior source of surplus value. This is where Schelling comes to help Marx in his ontology. Now I shall show that Schelling is ultimately unhelpful in solving problems present in Marx's theory. The, quote, creative source of value. I want now to endeavor to show that in Dussel's Schellingian reading of the theory of valorization is a tension already implicit in Marx is raised to a higher level. Marx says two things, as Dussel rightly observes, that labor is the creative source of surplus value, quote, the universal value-creating element, end quote, and that capital is self-valorizing value. It is hard to know what, quote, self-valorization, end quote, can mean other than that capital creates value, which flatly contradicts the thesis that labor creates value. In Dussel, this contradiction appears in a particularly flagrant form because he interprets capital as a Hegelian totality, self-creative therefore, while using Schelling to bolster his claim that the creator of surplus value must be exterior to it. That living labor is, quote, not value, end quote, and thus capable of being the source of new value is something I find convincing. Where I dissent from Dussel, and indeed Marx, is that labor, quote, creates value, end quote. Typically, Dussel uses the phrase, quote, creative source of value, end quote. I suggest that this phrase should be disaggregated. Quote, source and, quote, creator are two different things. To give Dussel due credit, Dussel is usually sensitive to such conceptual subtleties in the theory of value. Dussel writes, quote, according to Marx, quote, to be, end quote, value, quote, to posit value, and, quote, to create value are three completely different concepts, end quote. To this I would add the concept, quote, source as a fourth. Let us explicate this conceptual scheme. Footnote. I presuppose here that genuine values result only from capitalist commodity production, but not from a supposed, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. To be value is to be a commodity. To posit value is to subject products to the exchange relation, or more precisely, it is capitalist presenting its products for exchange. To create value is to produce capital by means of capital. Monies purchasing commodities that are labor power and means of production, which are applied to a production process, which create a commodity of ideally augmented value, which are sold for money that are in excess of the money initially put into the purchasing of the initial labor power and means of production. Sorry, I'm just trying to What it really actually says in the text is M-C ... P ... commodity C prime M prime. I'm trying to explain that process. To be the source of value is to be that out of which capital creates value. It is the ontological/metaphysical dependence of the valorization process on the labor process that grounds the claim that living labor is the source of surplus value. But source and creator should not be conflated. The source of the tree's growth is the soil and solar energy, but does the soil, quote, create the tree? This would be a strange way of thinking, or of talking. It is surely a matter of an immanent force in the tree itself that impels the tree to seize upon sources of nutrients so as to grow. Another example, a waterfall is the source of the power generated by hydroelectricity, but the waterfall does not, quote, create the electricity. That is the achievement of the dynamos. Water always had this capacity, it might be said, but only when harnessed and exploited in a particular way, as water is the power source for the generation of electricity by the machinery. In the same way, capital harnesses and exploits living labor so as to create value from this source of energy. If living labor is the source of capital accumulation, this still leaves capital's dynamic as the creative principle. It is just that it cannot plausibly claim to create itself out of nothing, as Hegel's idea may. Of course, it would be fair, although still contestable, to argue that labor creates use values, again, through using natural sources as well as its own energies, but that the surplus product is determined as surplus value and is indeed produced in the first place for that very reason, is not a result of living labor and living labor's aims, but of alienated labor, of labor as the use value of capital, infused with capital's drive for accumulation. Again, it may be proper to argue that value is nothing but, quote, alienated, reified labor, end quote. But such a claim that labor is the, quote, stuff, end quote, of value, so to speak, does not prove that labor created value any more than the marble created the statue. What we need to do is to start from Dussel's explication of living labor as, quote, the other, of capital to enter into their dialectic. Each, by being incorporated in its other, becomes other than itself. Thus, living labor in the, quote, exteriority is other than capital, but subsumed under capital, it is at the same time other than itself, alienated labor. The same thing happens to capital when it descends from the self-referring ideality of value to the materiality of production. But of course, this process of mutual othering is not balanced. The struggle for dominance is won by capital, which successfully returns from the sphere of production with surplus value, while living labor returns from the factory exhausted and deprived of its own product. Realization of capital is derealization of the worker. But if this is so, it cannot be living labor as such that creates value, but wage labor, that is, alienated labor which is reified in value. This is because what creates value is not the ahistorical labor process, but only under capital's totalization, whereby capital produces value out of its exploitation of labor. Labor is, quote, objectified as capital, not labor, end quote. Dussel's conceptualization of living labor as the, quote, creative source of value is part of his self-confessedly, quote, Schellingian reading of Marx, which I have already explained. This also results in a slightly wrong picture of their relation. Dussel typically provides charts in which the capital totality and the capital totality's exteriority are pictured side by side with input from the capital totality inputs from the capital totality's exteriority to the capital totality. What is missed here is Marx's continual reference to the inversion characteristic of capital. In Dussel's picture, it seems implausible to speak of the capital totality at all, since the, quote, outside, end quote, is perfectly obviously subverting capital's claim to be a whole. The true picture is that the exteriority is subsumed or, quote, overgrasped, end quote, in Marx's phrase, begreifen. By the totality, since what is real and what is its mediation change places as a result of inversion. As we shall see in the next section, it is capital's, quote, identity and, quote, non-identity with its other that provokes confusion. Evidently, these remarks of mine go beyond Dussel to Marx himself. Dussel's interpretation of Marx, as far as it goes, is fair as an interpretation. Is labor everything? Because Dussel insists that living labor is the creative source of value, Dussel misreads a passage in which Marx is glossing the views of the socialist Ricardian Pierre C. Ravenstone. This is what Marx said. Quote, Ricardo's phrase, quote, labor or capital, end quote, reveals in a most striking fashion both the contradiction inherent in the terms and the naivety with which those terms are stated to be identical. It was natural for those thinkers who rallied to the side of the proletariat to seize on this contradiction, ... Labor is the sole source of exchange value and the only active creator of use value. This is what you say. On the other hand, you say that capital is everything and the worker is nothing or a mere production cost of capital. You have refuted yourselves. Capital is nothing but defrauding of the worker. Labor is everything, ... Just as little as Ricardo and understands the identity of capital and labor in his own system, do they understand the contradiction they describe. Dussel, end quote. Dussel seizes on the phrase, quote, labor is everything, end quote, and treats that phrase as Marx's own. But it is clear Marx here speaks for the socialist Ricardians. It does not follow he endorses it. In truth, he does not. He regards this claim as equally as one-sided as that of the bourgeois theorists who think capital is everything. Neither side has understood that there is an objective contradiction here. Both claims are true, and neither makes sense on its own. It is worth exploring this issue in some detail. In doing so, we can quote Dussel against himself by drawing on this passage in which he recognizes the power of the capital totality. Quote, this ontological act by which the, quote, exteriority of, quote, living labor is denied, and by which the latter is totalized or subsumed, is the laborer's, quote, alienation, negation of the other, different from capital, and constitution of living labor as, quote, wage labor, end quote, end quote. By this act of constituting labor as wage labor, capital constitutes itself. By this act of constituting labor as wage labor, capital constitutes itself and embarks on capital's inherent dynamic of accumulation. This cannot be explained on the basis that, quote, labor is everything, end quote, any more than the claim that I am, quote, nothing but, end quote, water and carbon explains my life cycle. Once a system has achieved sufficient complexity, powers emerge that cannot be reduced to those of its constituent elements. The capital system exhibits precisely such emergent powers, regardless of whether or not the capital system emerges from some original, quote, ontological act, as Dussel maintains. Successfully subsuming living labor and consistently reproducing the capital relation, capital has a fair claim to assert, quote, I am everything, end quote. That labor power has to be reconstituted in a non-capitalist domestic sphere. It can dismiss as a secondary derivative function to be treated as a black box in the circulation of commodities. Dussel, when driven to qualify his view, says the converse. Dussel states that Marx's system of categories, quote, is nothing but the development of the concept of, quote, living labor, ... within which the development of the concept of, quote, capital is a secondary and founded moment, ... Everything is labor, capital is nothing but labor, end quote. This view gives inadequate attention to the concept of capital. Capital seizes living labor under the wage form and reifies it in the value of commodities. As value, labor is the opposite of, quote, living labor. It is negated, derealized, rather than realized labor. It is implausible to think labor could perpetrate this crime against itself. It has to be the result of something else. Capital, albeit that capital is, quote, nothing but, end quote, labor, it has become autonomous, labor's own other. Quote, capital shows itself more and more as a social power, ... an alienated social power which has become independent and confronts society as a thing, end quote. Marx. This objective social power of capital, quote, Hodgkin regards ... as a pure subjective illusion that conceals the deceit and the interest of the exploiting classes. He does not see that the way of looking at things arises out of the actual relationship, end quote. True, if the concept of capital is developed, it leads back to labor as we see in Marx's Capital by Chapter 7, but as labor's other at the same time, capital requires recognition of its own effectivity. Marx is capable of taking both perspectives in a single passage. Quote, in the first appearance of capital, these presupposition themselves, bracket, material instruments and labor capacity, end bracket, appeared outwardly to emerge from circulation, to be given in circulation. These external presuppositions now appear as moments of capital itself, as results of capital's own production process, so that it itself presupposes them as its own moments and conditions, ... All the moments which confronted living labor capacity as alien, external, bracket, powers, end bracket, consuming and using it under certain conditions independent of it, are now posited as its own product and result, end quote. In passages as these, Marx seems simply confused about what has priority, capital or labor. But the truth is that these are so closely intertwined that both perspectives have validity. In a sense, capital totalizes and reproduces all of capital's presuppositions, while in another sense, this totality is itself the result of alienated labor. The capital relation is a contradictory unit. Any attempt to remove the contradiction ideologically by claiming, quote, all is capital, or, quote, all is labor, will find such a reductionist program impossible to carry through coherently. Labor's alienation and capital's self-constitution are inseparable. It is of the highest importance to understand that the contradiction in the capital relation is not between capitalist and labor. That is merely a conflict. The inner contradiction arises because both, quote, capital and, quote, labor have claims to constitute the whole of their relation. Hence, quote, capital is nothing but alienated labor, end quote, and, quote, labor nothing but variable capital, end quote. In a word, capitalism is characterized by a, quote, contradiction in essence, end quote. The standpoint of critique. The problem of rightly interpreting Marx's critique is that for much of capital he has to enter into the capital totality. In a sense, therefore, there is the risk that the reader becomes engulfed in this and sees even labor as nothing but a factor of production organized by capital. Dussel's work is a wonderful corrective to this, and he pinpoints the problem just noted. Quote, from the moment at which totality, capital, subsumes exteriority, living labor, Marx's discourse starts showing all the intrinsic determinations of capital, of the totality. Thus, quote, totality may seem to be the ultimate category, for totality absorbs almost all of his later discourse, end quote. Misreading is possible since much of Marx's analysis is about the already constituted totality. For example, the problem of fixing prices of production. Dussel's merit is to draw attention to the grounding of the totality on its exterior input, living labor. Much criticism of Marx, such as from neo-Sophians, is from the standpoint of the always already constituted reified system, ignoring how living labor becomes subsumed in this already constituted reified system. Capital, the book, shows us the production of capital by means of capital. Footnote. I take this phrase from Marco Guidi. End footnote. In this sense, the self-identity of capital is the book Capital's main theme, and it was possible for readers not to grasp the dependence of capital on what is radically, quote, other than capital. Living labor that is conceptually inseparable from its subsumption under capital is wage labor. Dussel is absolutely right to stress this point, quote, the other, then, quote, totality, in the, quote, exteriority, is nothing for the being of the system, but is still real. The, quote, reality of the other resists from beyond the, quote, being of totality, end quote. However, rather than put the point in this neo-Schellingian fashion, it would be better to follow the model of Feuerbach's anti-Hegel critique. According to Feuerbach, because Hegel inverted the relation between thought and reality, his philosophy construed reality negatively, as merely the other of the idea. The idea posits itself in negating this, its negation. But, asked Feuerbach, quote, why should that which owes its certainty only to itself not stand higher than that whose certainty depends on the nothingness of its opposite, end quote. Hegel's inversion must itself be inverted so as to put at the center, quote, man as the basis of nature, end quote, positively grounded on himself. The parallel move in the critique of political economy begins from the incontestable fact that without use value there is no value. However highly mediated the value form becomes, no matter how remote from reality are certain financial instruments, the, quote, topsy-turvy, end quote, world of capital must mediate itself in the labor process. The labor process, by contrast, however distorted by the requirements of valorization, does not in itself require its current mediation in the latter. But the analogy with Feuerbach must be pressed far... Sorry. My mouth is farting. The labor process, by contrast, however distorted by the requirements of valorization, does not in itself require its current mediation in capital. But the analogy with Feuerbach must not be pressed too far. To follow Feuerbach in his passion for, quote, immediacy, here would be to miss the point that production must always be socially mediated. The problem with the value form is that the value form is an alienating and alienated mediator rooted in the aversion of concrete and abstract. To conclude, Dussel is right to identify living labor as the appropriate standpoint of critique. The reality of this standpoint of critique is still historically open-ended. Given total alienation, our critique, quote, refusal, end quote, Marcuse, would be utopian in the scientific sense of unlocated, or even dislocated. Only revolutionary practice can, quote, prove the truth, end quote, of this unknown Marx. In spite of occasional defects, this is an original and thought-provoking work, and Dussel is surely right in his confidence that more than the first, 1883 to 1983, Marx's second century, end quote, will be the source of an ongoing critique of global capitalism. However, Towards an Unknown Marx at £70 is likely itself to remain, quote, unknown unless you bully your library to get it. Thanks for listening.